Welcome, age of vintage society. George Peppard is the actor who played the smitten neighbour in the iconic film Breakfast at Tiffany's with Audrey Hepburn in 1961, but probably is better known to younger generations as the tough, cigar-chomping commander of the A-Team on television in the early 80s. Was George Peppard banned because of his drinking habit? Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. George trained first on Broadway and then broke into television and made a strong start in the film industry in 1957 with The Strange One. Not long after this he was established as a leading man, arguably giving his most memorable film performance in Breakfast at Tiffany's just 4 years later. Handsome and elegant, he displayed considerable talent through his 26-year career, but was very often cast in formulaic action hero roles that were just too easy for him. He was an Adonis in looks, but he didn't rely on them. He worked hard at his acting and was a skilled performer at a time when celebrities and personalities were a dime a dozen in the film industry. George was never a huge star, but he was a skilled professional and reliable actor, and his star shone brightly before he crashed and burnt out at the tail end of his career. He was born in Detroit just in time for the Depression, when his parents not only had lost all their money, but had suffered 5 miscarriages before their only child, George, was successfully carried to term. His father, George Peppard Sr., was a building contractor, and his mother, Vernelle Rohrer, was a contralto star with light opera companies and the head of the voice department of the Detroit Conservatory of Music, and then became a member of the music faculty of the University of California until her death. During his school years, George's father had to leave Detroit to find work, and George played the piano briefly before discovering football. George graduated from Dearborn High School, a suburb of Detroit, where he was also a successful middle-distance track man. As soon as George finished high school, he enlisted in the Marine Corps, where he stayed for 2 years, leaving in January 1948 with the ranking of corporal. He then enrolled at Purdue University later that year, where he studied civil engineering. It looked like he was about to follow in his father's footsteps. While at Purdue University, George became interested in acting and joined the Purdue Playmakers theatre troupe and became a committed member of the acting community by writing sketches and acting whenever he could. He made his first stage appearance in 1949 at the Pittsburgh Playhouse. As he became more interested in acting, his grades fell and he was put on probation. He decided that he didn't want to be an engineer any longer, later calling it the best decision he had ever made. George got his grades back up and then transferred to the Carnegie Institute of Technology, where he discovered serious drama like Shakespeare and Greek tragedies. His father died in 1951, and George had to take time off from his studies to take over his dad's business. He passed the tests for a state license and completed the 15 projects that his father had outstanding. It was about this time that George realized that engineering wasn't for him, and despite his mother's disappointment, George headed back to college and got his degree in 1955, a year later than expected. The death of his father is the supposed trigger of George's drinking, which was to become more and more out of control for the next 30 years. After finishing his degree, George did 2 seasons at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and then went to New York and entered Lee Strasberg's acting laboratory and became a method actor. He had the looks, but he wanted the skills to go with his career aspirations. He supported himself during this time as a taxi driver, motorbike mechanic, disc jockey, radio station engineer, fencing instructor, and even a bank teller to keep the rent rolling in. In 1954 he married Helen Davis, the longest and first of his 5 marriages. They had 2 children, Bradford, who became a marketing executive, and Julie, who became an actress. His first Broadway appearance was in Girls of Summer in 1956. While George received favourable accolades, critics panned the play, and it closed after 56 performances. His next Broadway appearance in The Pleasure of His Company in 1958, which starred Cyril Ritchard and Cornelia Otis Skinner, also received good reviews. Soon he got roles in plays and TV series like Lamp Unto My Feet, The United States Steel Hour, and Bang the Drum Slowly, before he hit the big screen in 1956 in a movie called The Strange One. In order to become an actor of some calibre, it was always George's intention to have a solid acting base behind him. He wanted to be an actor renowned for his skills, not a star whose fame was based on their personality and love life. In the late 1950s, George appeared in a lot of TV work like Kraft Theatre, The Kaiser Aluminium Hour, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and Studio One in Hollywood. He still appeared in plays like The Minotaur and The Little Moon of Alban, where the New York Times called him excellent. His portrayal of the boyfriend who wanted to marry the director's daughter won him more praise from the New York Times again. He got offered a second film role in a Korean War movie called Pork Chop Hill because he was an unknown actor at the time. Many of the actors in this film went on to have long careers, such as Gregory Peck, Woody Strode, and Harry Gardino. Home from the Hill was his first contracted movie with MGM. The contract was a condition of MGM's, not something George wanted to do. The film featured a number of new actors that MGM wanted to develop. The film was a success but didn't make a profit due to the high production costs. There was a lot of interest in George, and Hedda Hopper, a leading film critic, predicted that George would be a big star, saying, "He has great emotional power, is a fine athlete, and does offbeat characters such as James Dean excelled in." Although a lot of the films he was rumoured to be about to star in didn't come to fruition for him, his television roles grew in number and quality. With his good looks, charm and elegance, backed up by solid acting skills and a commitment to his craft, George's breakthrough role was as Paul Varjak, the love interest of Holly Golightly in the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's that was released in 1961. George was called the next best thing after this role and decided to concentrate on big screen roles. He had a number of roles lined up, but MGM cast him as the lead in their epic How the West Was Won, a massive hit by anyone's standards. He followed these breakthrough roles with The Victors, and then came another huge hit for George, The Carpetbaggers. In the cast was a young Elizabeth Ashley who had an affair with George, but after his 1965 divorce she did marry him a year later. By this time George had some of the trappings of a star, and he spent a bit of his second honeymoon learning to fly his new Learjet in Kansas. This marriage lasted 6 years and produced his second son and third child, Christian, who also became an actor. The 1972 divorce was acrimonious, with George forking out large amounts of money in alimony, child support and psychiatric care for his ex-wife. The 1960s were full of work in both television and film roles for George. He made The Third Day with his new wife Elizabeth and Operation Crossbow with Sophia Loren. Although George was hot property and very much in demand, he was also in debt. He was a 6-foot, blue-eyed blonde god who wasn't an untalented nothing who needed to be grateful to studios for any role that they offered. The studios didn't understand this very well and constantly expected George to play the role of a star by their rules. When George walked out of the set of The Sands of the Kalahari, Paramount sued him for $930,000 in damages. George countersued. He went on to have a hit with the Blue Max alongside Ursula Andress and James Manson, and then in Tobruk with Rock Hudson. George carried these films because of his acting skill and his good looks. He had a touch of meanness and menace about him, and could have easily been the latest tough guy, roles he was constantly being offered. In the mid-60s, George bought a cattle ranch to help secure his finances. He needed to sign a contract with Universal in order to achieve this, and he signed up for a 4-year, 5-picture contract that was worth millions. He shot Rough Night in Jericho, What's So Bad About Feeling Good, and House of Cards over the next few years for Universal. None of them were box office hits, and George began drinking even more heavily. His next role was in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, but he apparently turned it down as he didn't want to play a weak character that people might think was homosexual. George became more and more disillusioned with his next 4 films, Pendulum, a thriller, The Executioner with Joan Collins, and Cannon for Cordoba, a war movie, and One More Train to Rob, another western. He felt there were no good scripts and no good directors, and at some point he realised there never was going to be any for him due to his reputation of walking off set. He decided to tour Vietnam in 1970 with a USO show. In 1971 he created Trade Wind Productions, where he optioned a script, but the movie was never made. There were a few made-for-television movies like The Bravos and The Ground Star Conspiracy, but in 1971 he signed a contract to play Thomas Banachek, a Polish-American Boston-based insurance investigator, in a TV series for NBC. It was a role that George relished after playing action heroes for so long. He enjoyed playing an intelligent, sophisticated, well-educated role, where he also got to be a ladies' man. The series was well received by the public and the critics, and was picked up for a third season, but around this time his marriage to Elizabeth had broken down, and in order to stop her from getting a higher amount of money in the divorce settlement, he quit the series. The series was never revived. George then starred in Newman's Law, but when the filming ended he took some time off acting to concentrate on directing and producing. The burden of the alimony payments that he was obligated to make meant he had to go back to acting, and he picked up some more TV movies and a few series like Guilty or Innocent, The Sam Shepard Murder, and One of Our Own. His third marriage was to Sherry Boucher, an actor with just a few roles under her belt, who not only married him in 1975, but helped him to kick his drinking habit in 1978. He tried sci-fi with the film Damnation Alley, which now has quite a cult following. George loved the director's cut, but claims the movie was re-edited by the company executives and wasn't as good as the original cut. He then decided to produce, direct and act in the drama 5 Days from Home, as he didn't like any of the roles on offer. The movie-making process took about 3 years, during which time he had to remortgage his house and sell one of his cars to fund its production. He was getting deeper and deeper into debt, but in the end the movie was a success, and he got his money back. His third marriage didn't survive the movie-making process, however, and in 1979 they divorced. Despite his acting portfolio, his perfectionism and the fact that he held everyone on set to his high standards left George doing more TV movies, and at one point a game show, Password Plus. His episodes were pulled due to his on-camera comments about NBC, the show's producers. This stunt caused them to ban him from any future games shows, and they were more than happy to shoot extra shows to make up for the ones they pulled. While George's production company was developing 2 movies, a TV drama series and an educational series, George continued to look for a decent acting role. He had developed quite a drinking problem, but in 1978 he quit cold turkey and became deeply involved with helping others kick the addiction. A year later, in 1980, he was offered the role of Blake Carrington in the TV series Dynasty. While filming the pilot, George constantly clashed with producers and was eventually fired for his critique of the show. He felt that he had disappeared between the ages of 45 and 55, as no one wanted to work with someone who had quit 3 series and the millions to be made in them. He quipped that it was like crossing the mob. You find that people you thought were your friends aren't. But fortune was smiling on George, as he was then available for the role many remember him as, Colonel John Hannibal Smith, the leader of the A-Team. The role was perfect for him. George got to play a variety of characters within the role of a master of disguise. He made himself unforgettable as the witty cigar-smoking silver-haired leader of the A-Team, a group of Vietnam vets on the run from the military for crimes they didn't commit. The role worked for him as he shared the spotlight with other actors and got some downtime as they filmed scenes he wasn't in. This arrangement gave him more time with his family. In 1984 he married Alexis Adams, who welcomed his son Christian into the home where they lived together for the year it took his marriage to run its course. The A-Team was also good for George, as it introduced him to a new generation of fans and put him back in the spotlight that he loved. The A-Team was an instant rating success and was quickly one of the top 10 watched shows in the United States. His fee was about $50,000 an episode and reportedly went up to $65,000 an episode, making him one of the highest paid TV actors of the time. This was just as well as, "It's the first time I ever had money in the bank," Peppard said later. 4 California divorces and 25 years of alimony will see to it that you have no money in the bank. It was a giant boost to my career and made me a viable actor for other roles. The A-Team ran for 98 shows over 5 seasons and was nominated for 3 Emmy Awards. However, by season 4 the ratings dropped as the viewers were getting bored with the same formulaic result in every episode. By the time the production company realised and changed things up a bit, the series had run its race and was retired. While the A-Team was financially successful for him, it was one of the last really memorable roles he held. Although George spent most of his life as an actor, producer and writer, in his later years he gave a lot of his time to helping alcoholics recover and working for various charities. George then returned to the stage and played Ernest Hemingway, a man he felt he could really relate to, in a play called Peppard. They both had 4 wives and they were both heavy drinkers. He went on to play lead roles in Silence Like Glass and Night of the Fox, where he felt typecast but knew that fear and insecurity often ruled casting decisions. Films need to make money. He understood that people had expectations for him, and when he appeared in roles they weren't expecting, it showed at the box office, and so he played the roles. He needed the money too. He made a second series of Man Against the Mob, The Chinatown Murders, that was broadcast in 1989. A third series was planned, but George's life of drinking and smoking was about to catch up with him. By 1990, George was looking for funding for a play called The Crystal Contact that he hoped to produce and star to create steady work for himself. He was looking for one more hit show. His part of Henry II in the stage show The Lion in Winter was one of his favourite parts. George adored the role so much that he was quoted as saying, "When you find a part you are right for and you love, it's a source of happiness, believe me. If I could have my wish come true, I'd spend the next 2 years doing nothing but this play." His last marriage to Laura Taylor in 1992 also made him happy. They lived in a white Greek revival cottage with 3 huge porches and a guest house out the back in Hollywood Hills. Laura, a former Palm Beach banker, was a mental health counsellor who probably helped George through some of his darker moments. Unfortunately for George, his health was starting to catch up with him. Even though he had given up drinking, he had continued to smoke 2 to 3 packets of cigarettes a day. In 1992 he developed lung cancer and had an operation to remove a tumour in his right lung. George gave up the cigarettes at the same time. He starred in a 1994 episode of Matlock with Tracy Nelson as a character called Max Morgan. That was meant to be a backdoor pilot for a new series about an estranged father-daughter investigations team. The show aired just 8 days before he died. He was buried a week later in the Northview Cemetery in his hometown Dearborn, next to his parents. George appeared in more than 25 films after making his debut in 1957 in The Strange One, and many people think his earliest films were his best ones. These different characters and genres showed off his magnificent acting skills. Although he appeared with superstars like Gregory Peck, Robert Mitchum, James Stewart and John Wayne, George never properly became one himself. In the end, George was a man who loved his craft and gave it all right up to the last days of his life. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. George Peppard had no idea how to make real money for a long time during his career. What was Tyrone Power's secret to earn $642.5 million? Let's find out.